Picking the right buffer and spring combo can be the trickiest part of building an AR9, but if you're struggling to pick the right parts, you're in the right spot. I've spent weeks consulting my expert team, digging into the best resources online, and giving things a try out on the range to give you the top recommendations for buffers, springs, and more right here in this video. In today's episode, we'll break down the specific adjustments that can transform the feeling of your PCC's recoil, explain how picking the right buffer and recoil spring can enhance the PCC's reliability and even help reduce recoil, giving you greater control. And finally, we'll give you the formula for the exact weight for your buffer and spring setup to get a fully functional AR9 right away. Hey everyone, it's CJ with AT3 Tactical. So why do the buffer and spring even matter? In simple terms, your buffer and spring have two primary functions. Number one, to absorb the force of the bolt traveling rearward to slow it down. And number two, slide that bolt forward to chamber the next round into battery. These are the components that can impact the feeling of the recoil the most on your AR9, and selecting the right buffer and spring components on your gun can enhance or even perfect its reliability and enjoyability when firing it. If you do it right, swapping your buffer and spring can get you the smoothest and most reliable recoil experience possible. Really, every person and every gun is different when it comes to how they perceive recoil. I might feel recoil differently than my totally yoked buddy who hits the gym 6 times a week and twice on Sundays. But the main challenge for us for the rest of this video here is how we can turn an AR9 that is known for having snappy recoil into a gun that has gentle and smooth recoil while still cycling and operating consistently without any issues. Now, if you're looking for a lot more information than I can give you in this one video about buffers and springs for 9mm ARs, there's a ton of information out there on the interwebs, but I highly recommend checking out Blowback9's website and YouTube channel. He has a ton of information documented, and it's easily one of the best resources if you're looking to make a soft shooting AR9. Let's start out with the buffer. In the context of an AR-15, the buffer is housed, well, in the buffer tube. The primary job of the buffer is to provide mass to help slow things down, which as a side effect changes how the recoil is transferred into your body. Think of it kind of like a shock absorber of the firearm. It helps absorb the compression and rebound as the gun cycles, allowing for quicker follow-up shots and better control. Buffers come in different weights and can change how your gun functions and feels. Now, most of the original buffers that Colt designed for the AR9 had a buffer that looked kinda like this. It was a buffer that was 5.5 ounces and 3 3/4 inches long. However, this kind of buffer is not ideal for us today. The buffer we should use in a 9mm blowback gun is going to be a buffer that was designed to be used in an AR9. The reason why is they will usually be a little bit heavier, anywhere from 6 to 8 ounces, while also being physically larger. Since the 9mm case is shorter than pretty much any centerfire rifle cartridge you shoot, the bolt physically doesn't need to cycle as far back to eject the case through the smaller ejection port or to pick up the next round out of the magazine. Now, if you want to use a normal AR-15 buffer, you can use spacer weights behind the buffer in the buffer tube, or even the old trick of stacking a few quarters in the back of the buffer tube to make up for that extra travel. Keep in mind that the weight of a standard AR-15 buffer is probably going to be too light for an AR-9, as most AR-9s are still going to benefit from a heavier buffer. Going with a lighter buffer for an AR-9 typically increases the cycling speed, which could be useful, but may lead to more felt recoil because a lighter buffer has less mass to slow down the bolt, allowing that energy to be transferred into the shooter. Now, on the other hand, using a heavier buffer slows down the cycling process, which can again help reduce felt recoil, but going too heavy may make the gun feel sluggish or struggle to function correctly. The key here is finding the right balance for your AR9 build and your ammunition choice. If you do use a traditional AR-15 buffer in the 9mm AR without some type of spacer, you may experience overtravel, which means the bolt carrier is further rearward than is needed while cycling. This can cause problems like damaging the bolt, allowing spent casings to fall into the trigger area, which is a real pain by the way, and it can also put too much stress on the buffer tube, which could lead to cracking and, in a worst case scenario, the buffer tube blowing out the back. Ideally, the bolt should only travel back enough to either engage the bolt catch or to pick up a fresh round out of the magazine. A lot of 9mm buffers will usually have reciprocating weights as well. These sliding weights create a delayed energy transfer, softening the impact of the bolt carrier group against the buffer. This is called a dead blow effect, and those weights can move around in the buffer, and this will help counteract any bouncing that will happen as the bolt comes to a rest. The sliding weights in the buffer will also spread out that energy transfer over a longer time frame, which helps minimize peak forces during cycling, which is super important in a blowback operated AR9. A lot of felt recoil reduction is going to be gained by slowing things down. Instead of a quick hard punch, we can turn that recoil into a firm push. If you want to fine-tune your recoil even more, you can get things like adjustable buffers. Adjustable buffers often come with multiple weights, typically made from aluminum, steel, or tungsten, that you can add or remove to adjust the total weight. When using an adjustable buffer, you'll want to go to the range and experiment to find the right weight that allows for reliable cycling, proper ejection patterns, and mitigate recoil, but we'll get into what to look for at the range in just a little bit. One of the most popular brands for adjustable buffers is the Odinworks AR9 adjustable buffer. Using an adjustable buffer can help you tune your AR9 for different loads, or if you're super cool and you're using a suppressor, which can also affect how your gun cycles. Okay, so don't miss this, because here is the magic formula for most AR9 buffer weights. It is recommended to have a bolt and a buffer combined weight of at least 22 to 24 ounces or more. 9mm buffers are usually going to be heavier because most modern bolts do not weigh the full 16 ounces intended for the older Colt style buffer. To account for variance in bolt weights and to have a reliable AR9, we find that this weight range to be a good starting point depending on your variables like ammo and other environmental factors. But a starting point of 22 to 24 ounces is a great place to start. The bottom line is there's a lot of buffer options depending on your bolt, spring, and ammo and weight of your gun, which makes it kind of impossible to really tell you which buffer is best for you. To get an even smoother experience, you can build out the Blowback 9 trademarked Gentle Recoil system. This system is a little complicated to put together, so we aren't going to spend a bunch of time here to talk about it, but if you want to take a look into how to build out this system, links are in the description. Okay, next is the spring, and I may get some die-hard PCC fans mad at me in the comments for saying this, but a standard carbine spring, like this one here at AT3, is all that you need in a 9mm AR. Many AR9 enthusiasts say using heavier springs like 308 springs is a good idea to help reliable feeding and cycling of the system. However, you should not be using 308 springs, rifle-length springs, or any other type of springs. Using these can cause problems over the life of your gun because you will be bottoming out the spring in the buffer tube, and that can cause some serious problems for yourself or even worse, your firearm. You might also run into the problem of overspringing the system. Overspringing an AR9 can lead to a lot more issues other than just having too light of a spring. It can lead to frequent jams, misfeeds because the bolt does not travel far back enough, or it travels too far forward too quickly. It can also cause issues stripping a round out of the magazine and feeding it into the barrel. Likewise, you may also experience a lot more bolt bounce along with just beating up the components in your gun, leading to a shorter lifespan. If you're looking for flexibility with tuning your AR9, you could opt to go for a lighter bolt and a stronger spring. Many experienced 9mm shooters find using a lighter bolt and a tighter spring gives them more control in the tuning process. I would not recommend this for most normal 9mm shooters, however, but there are some people that like to have a little bit of extra flexibility and have no problems putting in the time to tune the system just right. The main problem when using normal carbine springs then is that they can be a little noisy after firing, since you will hear the spring twang around a bit in the buffer tube. If you want something a little bit quieter, you can use something like a flat wire spring to help reduce the sound because they'll be tighter, therefore coming to a stop more quickly in the buffer tube and reducing noise. Phew. Okay, now that we have learned a lot about what things you need to keep in mind when picking out a buffer and spring, let's talk about what you should be paying attention to in order to make sure that this thing works. When you take out your new AR9 to the range for the first time, there are a few factors you're going to want to be looking for when testing out your new buffer system. Focus on whether your gun just shoots in the first place, and there aren't any major issues like failures to feed or failures to fire or eject or anything. If your gun cycles consistently without any malfunctions, you're on the right track. Next, pay attention to felt recoil. If you picked out the right parts, you should have soft and easy recoil control. If your AR9 feels snappy or hard to control, that might be a good indication you need to swap your buffer or spring for something different. If it does feel pleasant to shoot, you can move on to the next thing to look for, the ejection pattern. Ideally, spent casings should eject at roughly 3 to 5 o'clock position, and they should land about 6 feet away. The ejection pattern suggests that the bolt is moving at the right speed with the right amount of force from the tension of the spring and the weight of the buffer. Ejection patterns that are too far forward or backward can indicate that you have a buffer that is too light or too heavy. A buffer that is too light may cause erratic ejection, while one that is too heavy might result in weak ejection, so pay attention to where those little casings are going. If the ejection is too weak or inconsistent, it could also mean an issue with the recoil spring, such as it being too strong or too weak for your setup. That's why, again, using a standard carbine spring helps reduce variables here. Lastly, after a few hundred rounds, check for wear on components like the bolt catch if you have one. This can indicate a buffer or a spring problem if the bolt slams that bolt catch too hard. If you see wear on components, some experimentation may be necessary to find the optimal setup for your specific build. Now that you have things dialed in just right, there are other options outside of the traditional buffer and spring setup that are called captured spring systems. With these gentle recoil springs, there are two big advantages. Number one is noise mitigation, since the spring and buffer weights are all integrated. But let's get more specific and let's talk about an upgrade that's been getting a lot of buzz in the AR9 community, the JP Silent Captured Spring, SCS, and the Armaspec Stealth Recoil Spring, or SRS. JP pioneered this technology, and it has gained popularity with the entire AR community because it's designed to replace your standard buffer and spring setup, which for some people may reduce felt recoil because of its multi-stage design that helps absorb and distribute recoil forces more effectively than a standard buffer and spring setup. One of the best things about the captured spring options is that they are a drop-in replacement. No gunsmithing is required here, so just take out your existing buffer and spring and slide it down into the buffer tube and you're ready to roll. If you intend on using your AR9 with a folding stock, there are some incompatibilities to be aware of. However, there are some potential solutions for integrating these systems with folding stock adapters. For example, JP offers a conversion kit specifically designed for use with the Law Tactical folder, allowing users to effectively combine the SCS with a folding adapter. For the SCS or the SRS to be compatible with 9mm builds, you have to be running a proper bolt. For proper function in 9mm rifles or pistols, the extra weight held in on the back of the bolt carrier with a roll pin needs to be removed. Certain bolts like the Air Precision bolt may not be compatible due to their specific design, so look carefully at product listings and bolts to see if it's compatible. You can definitely get into the nitty-gritty of using lighter bolts, heavier springs, and captured springs to tune your gun just right, but just be aware that usually tuning your buffer and spring combination requires testing different buffer weights and spring weights, which can take a bit of time and may not also be the nicest on your wallet. That is where an adjustable buffer like the Odinworks is nice. Yes, it costs a lot more than a traditional run-of-the-mill buffer, but you can change out the weights to help tune your PCC without having to buy multiple buffers. Just remember, when tuning any firearm, reliability should always be the top priority. So as usual, there's a lot of options out there, but what are we going to go with in our build? For our build, I'm going to go with the Armaspec Stealth Recoil Spring. Going with this gets us a smooth and quiet recoil system that's easier to work with and should get us pretty decent recoil reduction compared to a traditional buffer and spring setup. Even though other buffer and spring options might give me smoother recoil, I can get most of the way there by going with a setup like this, so that's what we'll do here. So there's a few things to remember from this video, so here's a quick summary of things to remember when picking out a buffer and spring system. The buffer and bolt should weigh together 22 ounces or more, and your buffer ideally should be about 4 inches long and have sliding or reciprocating weights inside. You do not have to use any special type of spring. A normal carbine spring is all that is needed for proper 9mm blowback systems. If you want to elevate your setup even further, in the finale of the 9mm build guide, we'll look into the essential upgrades that can enhance any PCC's functionality and versatility, so give it a look right here.